Welcome everybody. This is the Living with Wildfire in Southern Gulf Islands webinar. Just 1 minute while we let people kind of filter in. All right. It is 7 o'clock. We have a lot of people online. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we're doing a webinar called Living with Wildfire in the Southern Gulf Islands. Very timely. It is mid-July, another hot day here in the Southern Islands, Southern Gulf Islands and Southern Island as well. My name is Jonathan Reimer. I'm from the Capital Regional District, which is the local government here for you in the Southern Gulf Islands. And we're going to be talking about the wildfire risk very specifically to the Southern Gulf Islands and how you can prepare yourself and your home for wildfire. So just a quick introduction to how it's going to go today. Here is the agenda. We'll do a really quick orientation to Zoom, but all of you have made it this far, so that's a good news at least. And then we have two presentations for you. One called Living with Wildfire, that's by me, so you have to listen to me for a little bit there. And then we also have a co-presentation from Parks Canada called Understanding Local Wildfire Risk. The presenter there will be Jay Zakalewski. And he is the Fire Management Officer with Parks Canada and a Wildfire Behavior Specialist. I'll be introducing him shortly. Following those two presentations, we'll have a question and answer session. And all in all, we're hoping to get a lot of information downloaded into brains in about an hour and a half, both for the presentations and for the questions. So thank you very much for joining us. Just a quick word about Zoom. Almost everybody's grandmother now actually knows how to use Zoom and these online platforms, but just so everybody's on the same page, this webinar is being recorded, so just be aware of that. We do hope to share this webinar with all of the participants after we're complete here, and hopefully make it online available for streaming, because I think this is a lot of good information for residents of Southern Gulf Islands. You probably do note that your video and your audio have been disabled, so you won't be able to turn that on for better or worse. As well, for the most part, chat is disabled, but you can use it sometimes to get through to us. So if you are from an emergency response agency, and I'm thinking specifically of fire departments, BC Wildfire, perhaps RCMP, or any other response agencies, just let us know. Type in the chat who you are and where you're from. Lets us know who we have around, just in case we have a question that we can use your expertise for. And then the one that you'll be really able to use is that Q&A box. It's right either in the toolbox, the top or the bottom, looks just like that picture right there. At any time during the presentation today, if you want more information on something that was said, or you want information on something that we didn't address today, type that in. We're going to be able to see those questions. We're going to take all of those questions and select some of the ones that we think are the most useful to discuss today and answer them live here with the panel. Probably myself or Jay will speak to most of those questions. So that's the orientation. Without further ado, let's get into it. And so today there's going to be a heck of a lot of information that is given to you about wildfires. There's not going to be a test. You certainly don't have to memorize it, but there's a few things I want you to walk away from the seminar today with. Is that I want you to feel like you have a better understanding of what the wildfire risk specifically in Southern Gulf Islands is, what you can expect when there is a wildfire in your area, And then the third and perhaps the most important thing to me is that you're going to have a better understanding about what you can do to help protect yourself, your family, and then your home as well. So with that, I'll introduce myself. My name is Jonathan Reimer. I've been privileged to work most of my career with wildfire as both a researcher and a practitioner. I was an incident commander and a crew leader with BC Wildfire, also with Parks Canada on the National Incident Management Team. I was the provincial duty manager with Emergency Management BC. And then most recently now, I am the manager of fire and emergency programs here in the Capital Regional District. I also play the role of the Emergency Operations Center Director. So I'm interested in fire. I really love the topic of fire. It's an incredible thing, and I think it's an important thing to be engaged with. It's a very timely topic, obviously. This last week and a half has been perhaps even historic in BC. We've seen some really startling impacts to communities, and we've even seen 2 fatalities in the last week and a half in BC from wildfire, which is a relatively rare occurrence out here. So with that, the topic of today is really, what does all of this mean for the Southern Gulf Islands? And I know that you are probably being inundated with wildfire information. You see it on your social media feeds, you'll see it on the news, you'll hear it on the radio, particularly this last few weeks. And oftentimes you're going to be seeing news stories from as far away as Europe or California, perhaps Australia. And it's not really easy to understand, hey, what does Lytton have to tell us about our lives and what we can do to prepare for wildfire? So just to kind of summarize the type of information that you're probably seeing, certainly Australia, for example, in 2020 had a really busy year, a lot of incredible community impacts. California is a standard in the news. It's something we hear a lot about their wildfire seasons for good reason. There's a lot of conflict between wildfire and population out there. You're seeing a fire here from Southern California and that chaparral forest. And then, of course, in British Columbia, a little bit closer to home, we seem to be breaking records almost yearly. So in 2017, we broke the record in modern history for the most hectares burnt in the province. In 2018, we broke that record again. And here we are, early July in 2021, and we're discussing really huge impacts to communities like in Lytton, BC. And this is just a quick before and after picture with the Street View on the left-hand side there, but you can see the type of impact it had in Lytton. A very fast-moving wildfire with very little warning, caused complete devastation, and unfortunately some loss of life as well. So here in the Southern Gulf Islands, very idyllic. We have a long history of wildfire, and if you look back into the history books, there's examples of wildfire impacting communities in the 20s, in the 40s, evacuations, and so on. But in modern history, in living memory, we have a very limited amount of wildfire knowledge. We do have one wildfire that everyone knows, 2006, GALIANO Island. We'll be talking about that and various other examples. But it's not always easy to understand what is our risk, other than we know it's dry, we know it's hot, we know we have some danger, but how much is it? And we know it's getting worse. Climate change is happening, and climate change is really becoming a game changer. It's the biggest factor in the increase in fire behavior that we're seeing across North America and the world. What we're really seeing there, of course, is temperatures rising by an average of about 2 degrees through Western North America since 1970. That means where we do get snow, where we don't get snow a lot in Southern Gulf Islands, but when we do, it melts faster. We're seeing really that rain-free period for summer extending both through spring and through fall. And that means that our forests are drier for longer. We're seeing more lightning. That lightning is starting more fires, and those fires across the province are burning more hectares than ever before. And we have every reason to expect that that trend is going to continue and continue fairly significantly into the future. So with all this, what you can call doom and gloom, there's lots of reasons to be fearful. But with my message today for you guys on the Southern Gulf Island is don't panic. And the reason for that, I'm going to get into now. And it's fire behavior science is a really good resource for us. And it's quite an established tool for understanding fire risk. If we understand, for example, where a fire starts, what it's burning in, what fuels, vegetation it's consuming, and what the weather is doing, we can tell you with really good degree of accuracy how hot that fire is going to burn. We can tell you how fast that fire is going to spread. And then we can also say where that fire is going to be both vertically in the canopy and then horizontally across the landscape. By the same token, in that same fire science, if you tell us in an area about how many fires are starting or we can expect to start, what's causing those fires, what your vegetation and ecosystems look like, and what weather patterns you get in an area, we can tell you with a really good degree of accuracy about how much fire risk is in that area. And there's a number of names we use for that fire risk. We can call it fire hazard, we can call it burn probability. I'm going to show you an example that I like from the United States. This doesn't show on our area, but it's a good example of how this type of analysis works. So this is the continental United States, a little bit of Alaska to the south there. And you can see the idea here is that it's able to say where that risk is. Certainly lots of reds and oranges over on the left-hand side of the screen there in the Western United States. And that's probably consistent with the messages that you get as far as what you hear about in the news. You hear about New Mexico and California and Nevada and Oregon, Washington, Idaho, those areas with a lot of fire risk in terms of this wildfire hazard potential. We're not on the map directly, but as you can see, moving over a little bit to that northwest, starting to go down a little bit more green, so a bit less fire danger than some other parts of Washington. And we're just going to zoom in here a little bit. This was an analysis done a couple of years ago on just Washington and Oregon. Same story, more or less, a little bit more detail. Most of that fire risk is to the east of the Cascade Mountains there. So that's where you see the oranges and the yellows. As you move towards the coast, and particularly the northwest coast, here you have the San Juan Islands and the Olympic Peninsula. So we're not quite on here, but those are our neighbors. You can see that fire behavior, or that fire risk, sorry, dropping and falling off to almost nothing in some areas. So moving into BC, this is an analysis that BC Wildfire publishes called the Provincial Strategic Threat Analysis. Same idea, more or less. The colors are a little bit punchier than the United States, but that doesn't mean we have any more fire risk. But the story is more or less the same as what we're hearing from the States. On the right-hand side of that screen, you can see little bits of green. Those are the Rocky Mountains along the Alberta border. Towards the coast there, another layer of green, and sandwiched in between them, a lot of oranges and yellows and some reds. So very specifically, we can see a lot of high fire danger up through the Okanagan, up through the Fraser Canyon, into the Caribou, and then around the Chilcotin Plateau and up through the northwest, of course. As you move down towards our area, you're probably seeing what does gray mean. And let's zoom in here and have a look. Just before we do that, actually, you might be trying to find Lytton, just for context, and you can see it kind of in that sea of orange and red there. So very high fire danger, fire risk. And then the fire risk for Southern Gulf Islands, when you zoom in on that same map, this is the reason I don't like to show this map very much. You don't get much detail. In fact, some of our islands are not even on this map. So it's not that they have fallen to the ocean. The problem with BC wildfires analysis is they don't like to show the risk in private lands. And we have a lot of private lands in our area. However, you can see a little bit, kind of squint. You can get a story that says, okay, there's some low and some moderate fire danger in the Southern Gulf Islands, Salt Spring Island, Sydney, and so on. You can see that giant half of Duncan over South Spring. So it's hard to get any kind of detail here. But definitely, I think what you were seeing and what we've seen in practice is that we don't have the type of risk that other parts of the province does. And why don't we have that? I kind of want to tease that apart here so that we understand what are the components of fire risk and what do they mean in the Southern Gulf Islands. And so the first of that, and perhaps the most important in some ways, is ignitions, because you can't have a fire that doesn't start. There has to be some ignition, some point, some cause of that fire. And there's only two ways that fires start here in BC. It either happened from a lightning bolt, there was a big lightning cloud from a convective column, or someone did something. There was a human cause, and that's a really big category. So that could be an electrical pole. That could be a car accident. It could be an off-road vehicle, could be an illegal burning, could be an escaped campfire. There's a lot of ways, fireworks, for example, that people can start fires, but someone did something to start that fire that caused that fire to start and to spread. In BC, most fires start from lightning. That's true this year as well. We're almost bang on that 60% number for lightning this year and in general. And the fires that start from lightning tend to burn to be larger fires, and they tend to be more difficult to put out for a number of reasons. The good news here locally in the Southern Gulf Islands is that we get very little lightning to the point where often people don't even know what it is when they hear that thunder. There's all sorts of posts on bulletin boards saying, hey, what's going on here? Because we get so little lightning, and that means we get so little lightning starts. That's really good news, just less fires on the landscape for us. The other thing that's not a surprise to us is our weather. Our weather is just dominated by the ocean, by the marine environment. The three biggest pieces of weather for fire danger or fire risk is temperature, humidity, and rainfall. And all three of those are really dominated by the ocean in our area. So just to take those in turn, temperature, for example, it can certainly get hot out there, but on an average temp high during fire season compared to places in the interior, I gave a couple examples here. Saturna, for example, has their average high during August is 20 degrees. Kelowna, that's 27, so a little bit of difference there. Humidity is a really big piece, really underappreciated in how it contributes to fire danger, because that's really what governs how much moisture there is inside the vegetation, which governs obviously how well that vegetation is going to burn. And our humidity here on the coast, much higher than the interior. So the average in Sydney, that's the best one I could find for today, 72%, Kelowna 55%, and that doesn't actually tell the whole story. Kelowna, it's not unusual to get into the single digits, whether that's 6 or 7% humidity. It would be relatively rare, in fact, quite rare for us to get below 30% humidity here on the coast. In rainfall, the story there is actually not quite as stark, because we do receive during the fire season, we receive very little rainfall. So there is a little bit of a difference between us and the interior. But the bigger difference actually might be that the rainfall in the interior tends to come in forms of convective clouds and thunder showers. So they'll get 20 or 30 millimeters sometimes in a number of hours, 2 hours perhaps. Where here on the coast, we tend to get our rain kind of more spread out, and that's good for the ground, good for the vegetation to be able to take that moisture and use it. The next piece of the puzzle here is the fuels. That obviously governs what's possible for fire on the landscape. And I've given you two examples here of fuels that do fairly well with fire. On the left, you have California. That's that chaparral forest. It's a brush, a dry brush. As you can imagine by looking at it, you can start a fire really easily in it. And when the fire does get going, it'll move that fire both vertically and horizontally very well. A little bit different, but more or less the same from a fire risk perspective is interior BC. So the picture here is a pine forest, a lodgepole pine forest that has been affected by the mountain pine beetle. That still is a problem in many parts of the province. And you can see just the density of fuels there, both horizontally and vertically. And same idea, easy to start a fire, easy to spread a fire. Now it's hard to kind of explore all of the different ecosystems or vegetation that you have on the Southern Gulf Islands. I think that's what's great about the Southern Gulf Islands, is the variety of what you have. But it generally, and in fact, you guys are in this coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimatic zone. It's a rare and special zone. It's by far the smallest of all the biogeoclimatic zones, and it tends to be to have the species that you see below there. It's a moist maritime zone. And as you can see, the fuel structure, both horizontally and vertically, just looks a little bit different. So you have some surface fuels, you have even some ground fuels there, the moss and some dried branches and other sorts of kind of forbs vegetation. Those do not receive fire as well, and certainly don't spread fire as well as the other types of vegetation we looked at. And perhaps as importantly, very difficult for a fire in that type to get enough momentum, to build enough heat intensity to move from the surface up into the canopy of those trees. So very difficult to get a crown fire in the types of forests that we get. Not impossible, but certainly more difficult. The other types of vegetation that it's worth thinking about in your area is you have a few open wooded grasslands. That grass is a fine fuel. It does receive fire fairly well, and it actually has a pretty good rate of spread. So it'll move that fire around horizontally. The good news there is that generally that fire is going to be low intensity and fairly easy to put out once the firefighters do respond to it. And I know you do have some more heavy fuels, but generally we're not talking about the same type of fuels as we're seeing other places in British Columbia. And climate change is definitely not a good news story for Southern Gulf Islands. I don't think we have to debate on whether it's happening. I think we're all on the same page. It's happening. It's going to make your fire situation much worse. But there's some relative good news here. Because your weather is dominated by the ocean is not warming as fast as the land. And so that means that our temperatures, our average temperatures, are not rising quite as fast as other parts of the province. And when you put all of that together, the upshot is that here on the coast, we're not seeing, and we haven't seen, the types of impacts to community from wildfires that they are seeing in other parts of the province. And so this graph is a little bit complicated to try and decode, but basically the Coles notes is that in the Caribou, Kamloops, Southeast, Prince George area, people remember when their community was evacuated, and it was fairly recently. On the coast, where most of the people live, most people don't remember or they know that it was a very long time since that community has been evacuated, which is really good news. So all of this together, that's the good news part of it, but I do want to add a few asterisks. I want to add a little bit of context to that information that I've given you. And particularly in two scenarios, I think it makes sense to pay attention. And that's when there's something that's happening to the weather or the vegetation, which makes what I've just presented not true for some reason or another. And the big one there that is worth thinking about is an outflow condition, outflow winds. And all of you know what that is, because that's what happened about a week and a half ago when we had that record-breaking heat that came in. We had hot air in the interior of British Columbia, and that hot air was pushing out through Fraser Valley, through Howe Sound, blowing over southern Vancouver Island, blowing over Southern Gulf Islands. And that air was much hotter than normal, clearly, and also much lower in humidity than normal. So that's creating the types of environment where a fire can start and spread fairly well. And the other time to pay attention is when you have some difference in fuel type, when something is not normal. And the one to really, I would say, concentrate there is probably the slash. As you can imagine, you're looking at those fuels. So that area has been logged now, and you have all that woody debris sitting out there, open to the air, open to the sun, and it's drying out. Easy to start a fire in that, easy to spread a fire in that. Almost all of the major fires that I was on the coast during my time as an incident commander with the BC Wildfire had a significant component of slash. It was probably slash driven for the most part. The good news there in general is that once the fire reaches the edge of that slash block and moves into mature timber, heavy timber, the fire behavior tends to rapidly decrease. And so it allows firefighters a much better opportunity to catch that fire once it moves into the heavy timber. Really changes things. So, you know, a little bit of good news, a little bit of bad news there. The other thing to pay attention to is invasive species. And I'm particularly thinking of broom and gorse here. They look kind of like that picture there. That's when they flower out and they're yellow. Those particular vegetation types, those plants are oily and they burn really hot, they burn really well. Most of your areas have some sort of community groups that get together and do invasive species removal. I would really encourage you guys to join those groups because you're really doing a good service for lowering the fire risk in your communities. So that's the first piece of what I hope to present today, is your fire risk there in the Southern Gulf Islands. Hopefully you have a better understanding there, and I want to pivot somewhat to what can you expect when a fire does come to your island in Southern Gulf Islands. And I want to be fairly clear today, is that fire is coming. Fire is part of your ecosystem, part of your landscape, and we have done a fairly rigorous job of trying to exclude it from your landscape, but it's not working anymore, and those policies are becoming less effective. So just to interpret the graph that you see in front of you, the blue lines are the amount of land that was burned every year in BC. It's hard to read. It starts in 1921, goes until 2018. So you can see the big heavy years, 2017, 2018 there on the right-hand side. The story is telling obviously a fair bit of fire, and then increasing resources, increasing fire exclusion, and then actually a few things happen in the mid-90s towards 2000, where those fire exclusion policies become much less effective and fire makes its presence known back on the landscape. We don't have really time to get into all of the reasons why, but I do want to make one quick point here, is that oftentimes we hear that, or think even, that there's an unnaturally high amount of fire on our landscapes. Say, when you hear about all this fire this year that's going on in the interior. And generally, that's not the case. So fire scientists and researchers can debate and have a healthy debate about how much more fire there used to be than there is today. But generally, what we do agree on, and in most places, there was more fire than there is today for various reasons. And I'm not going to get into this, but one of how we know is we can look back at, we have some incredibly long-lived trees in your area, and we can go back to the fire scars in those trees, and we can go back hundreds of years and see how it was impacted by fire. And the other thing we can look at is charcoal in lake sediment. And this is an incredibly complicated graph here, but what it's telling us is that we had a fair bit of fire about 4,000 years ago, a slow decrease over in this dotted black line of fire, and now we're seeing a resurgence in the fire. So fire's coming, and who comes when there is a fire? Who's going to be involved in that response? A few teams here. So you're going to see your local fire department. All of your major communities have a volunteer-run fire department, and they're going to be the incident commander on fires in your communities. The other folks you might see running around there is BC Wildfire Service. They're the ones who wear the red on the top and the blues on the bottom. Their local base here is in Cobble Hill, so a little bit farther away, but they tend to respond by helicopter in the Southern Gulf Islands. So the response time is actually fairly quick. They tend to be incident command on fires that happen outside of your community. In the Southern Gulf Islands, that means usually minor islands that don't have an organized fire suppression. So that could be Samuel Island, for example, or other smaller islands. The other thing that we are lucky to have in this area is a national park, and Parks Canada has a dedicated fire management team. So, and that's great to have on our doorstep. They would tend to be incident command on a fire that happens inside that park. And then last, but certainly not least, is the emergency program. There's an emergency coordination center on each one of the major islands in the Southern Gulf Islands. And what we do as an emergency program is make sure that all of the different response agencies are coordinating and talking with each other, that we're making sure that you as residents are informed about what's happening and that we're assisting evacuees if there is anybody that has to be evacuated for a wildfire. And oftentimes, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is that all 4 of these agencies and more will work together on that same fire because, you know, we have so many resources here locally. Oftentimes, I know being on an island, you feel a little bit alone, but there is an army of different resources ready, willing, and well prepared to help out in the event of a fire in your area. What are you going to see? You're going to see fire trucks, sometimes the big red ones. There's many different colors. You might see some smaller fire trucks. This is what BC Wildfire tends to use. And you'll often see these aviation resources. So helicopters, sometimes with that line and the bucket at the bottom there. It's picking up water from lakes, from rivers, and then it's transporting that water to the fire, dumping the water on top. You may also see some fixed wing resources. That's an air tanker is what we call it. It's dumping that red stuff. That red stuff is fire retardant. And the job of those resources is to slow that fire down so that people on the ground, crews, can safely access it and put that fire out. And what are the crews on the ground doing? Is they're probably moving water with pumps, probably exactly this pump. It's called the Mark III. They're carrying a whole bunch of hose to move that water. And we're often digging in the ground. And I know it looks a little bit silly, but it's an incredibly effective tool to get a layer of what we call mineral soil in between the side that you can have fire on and the side that you don't want to have fire on. Last, but certainly not least there, is sometimes we have to use fire to control an existing out of control fire. Isn't a tool we're able to use a lot on the Southern Gulf Islands, but it certainly is a tool that we do use. And you can see that in this particular case, it looks like they're using an old road as a fuel break. And the idea is that you can introduce a controlled fire, a low intensity controlled fire that can burn towards this uncontrolled fire. Together they meet, they run out of fuel, and they put themselves out. And so that's a tool that we use, and it's incredibly effective. So if you do see any of this in your area, I'm just going to reiterate this. You don't have to panic. Having a wildfire on your island, near your community, that's not necessarily any reason for panic. It's just part of living in BC. The vast majority of fires in BC don't impact people. On an average year, we'll have 1,500 fires in BC. So that's just normal. Of all of those, 96% are contained by fire crews when they're 4 hectares or below. For an example, last year, which was a particularly quiet year, we only had 3 evacuation orders for the entire year for the entire province. This year, there is a few more people evacuated. You know about those stories already. But even with all of the different evacuations going on, I believe we have about 25 of them. The total amount of homes that are evacuated right now is 1,400, give or take. So you have a wildfire in your area. The best thing that you can do, and the thing I'm going to ask you to do, is to get good information about it, to stay informed. And the reason I'm asking that is it's certainly my experience as an incident commander, where we're going in and working on wildfires, and then we re-enter the community, maybe to pick up food, maybe to sleep. And obviously we attract a lot of attention in town, and we tend to hear all sorts of really interesting stories about how that fire started, or what we're doing or what we're not doing on that fire. And generally those stories are a lot more interesting than sort of the stories that I have to tell them. And that's because the rumor mill starts up immediately. Everybody's talking, a fire gets people really interested, and that really spins up, neighbors talking to neighbor. But there's a lot of ways to get good information about what's happening on that fire and what we're doing. So please go on the internet. I'm really going to give a lot of props to BC Wildfire. They have an excellent website with a lot of good information, bcwildfire.ca. The information on that website is basically real time. It's as good as the information that we have in the Emergency Operations Center, or nearly as good. They also have an incredible app. They have the Facebook and Twitter. I'm also going to really advertise our Southern Gulf Island Emergency Program pages. We have a Facebook and Twitter account as well. and we share a lot of information. We'll be sharing any important emergency information that you need to know about wildfires on there. And there's a CRD website with a lot of good information about how to protect your home, how to prepare for wildfires, and so on. Do stay tuned. If you have a fire in Parks Canada, they're going to be issuing updates as well online. That middle column there, that icon, is meant to impart media. So any kind of reputable or known online source, they generally do a good job of trying to get good information and timely information and push that out to people. So you can trust that for the most part, whether that's internet, radio, or TV. And then just to be clear, that if you need information, you can get that information often directly from either the incident commanders or from the Emergency Operations Center. And we can do that in a few ways. One of those is the public alert notification system, and that's something you have to subscribe for. I'll be talking about that in a second. And the last, I just want to reiterate that if there's something you need to know, for example, if there's an evacuation order in your area, it's not something that you have to ask around the water cooler for. We're going to tell you. We're going to knock on your door. We're going to be driving around with loudspeakers. We're going to make sure that everybody who needs that information is receiving that information. So speaking of evacuations, we have two types of evacuation messaging for communities that are being impacted by wildfire. We have an alert and we have an order. Only one of those is actually, do you have to evacuate for? That's the evacuation order. So we'll start with an evacuation alert. Why do we give evacuation alerts? And we might do that as an incident commander or emergency operations center director, because we can imagine or we can foresee that this wildfire may impact a community in the next few days. And what we're trying to do is to give you guys in the community the maximum amount of time to plan, to say, hey, if I need to leave my home on short notice, where am I going to go? If do I have the supplies that I would need to do that? If I had to leave work, if I had to pick up my kids, what do I need to do to plan for an evacuation if it happens? Most of the time we issue an evacuation alert, that the community is actually not evacuated. It's just a warning that this is something that you might have to consider in the near future. So take it seriously, do prepare, but it doesn't mean that you have to panic in any other way. And the same is true if we have an evacuation order. The reason we've given you an evacuation order is that we can't 100% guarantee that the incident commander is going to be able to communicate an evacuation with plenty of time before that fire cuts off your route that you would be leaving by. At that time, we're going to issue an order because it's just not safe for you to be around in that area. Generally, these evacuation orders and alerts are fairly small. It's relatively rare for us to put an entire community on evacuation order or alert. Most often it is a few blocks, perhaps only a few houses, and it's just a bit of a heads up. Will your house survive if you are being evacuated? Almost certainly. Most people who are evacuated are able to return home to their house safely. But we do want you to be prepared in the event that there are some sort of impacts to your community. So that's what an evacuation is. That's what you can expect during an evacuation if you are evacuated. What we're asking you is to register at the reception center. You'll be given the location of that reception center during the evacuation. And the reason we're doing that is that a lot of people are going to be worried about you. And we want to make sure that everybody who is evacuated from an area has arrived safely and is able to be reunited with people who care about them. And so please do register if you do have to leave for an evacuation. I would recommend contacting your friends, your families, perhaps your neighbors just outside that evacuation area. You may want to stay with them for several days. They might be able to put you up. It's often a safe and comfortable place to be. If you do go to a hotel or get a restaurant meals during that time, you might be covered for insurance. So I would check the fine details of your insurance coverage. There's a number of different policies there. But what I don't want you to worry about is that if for some reason you have to leave your home on short notice for a wildfire, that you're going to be sleeping on the street or going hungry. No, there is a minimum standard of services that the province will deliver to you. That's called emergency support services. It's delivered actually by a really great group of volunteers. I would like everybody here, if you can, to look into helping those groups, perhaps volunteer for it yourself, just like your fire departments. And they can issue you some basic shelter. They'll issue you basic food. If you weren't able to grab clothes when you left, that's something that they can provide you. It's not going to be luxurious. It's going to be fairly basic, and I speak from experience in this. You might be sleeping on a cot, maybe in an auditorium or in a school hall, something like that. It could be with dozens of other people. It might be with hundreds of other people, but it's better than being out on the street, better than having nowhere to go. And so with all of this information that I've just given you, I know I've thrown a lot at you, I want to make it real a little bit. And I want to give you a little bit of an example about how this sometimes plays out in practice. And one thing a lot of people know about, and many of you actually experienced, was the wildfire in 2006 in Galiano. And this is what the news was saying at the time. And there's a lot more where that comes from, but I do want to just kind of walk through what happened there and whether that's going to be representative for us. So in a lot of ways, a really typical fire. It was a particularly dry year in 2006. At the time, it was the 4th driest year on record. We've had a few drier years since that time. There was strong outflow winds, like we were talking about. It was a human-caused ignition that happened during the fire ban, happened in late July. And the fuel that it burned in was a logging block, a block that was logged back in 1985. And so it had some regen in it, mostly 15 to 20-year-old Douglas fir on the overstory, relatively short, with significant slash debris underneath. So those were the fuels it burned in. I found it really difficult to get a lot of good landscape level pictures. So I apologize for the quality of these pictures. But you can see in the background, that's Montague Harbor, a little bit of a ridge here. And then you can see this is that regen, this is that logging block, and the fire burning in those fuels. This is how it looked a few days after that fire was put out here. So that's the same idea. You can see the slope. You can see that mostly the fuels were that old logging block. And then just to step through kind of what happened, there was an ignition around 5 p.m. By next morning, that fire had grown to about 20 hectares. The final size of that fire, about 61 hectares. So not a large fire by BC standards, but certainly on our islands. We don't have very large islands, and 60 hectares definitely makes a dent. What we do know is that the crews responded really quickly, and they responded really aggressively. They had really good success. So on scene, within a few minutes, we had something called GALIANO Fire Department. Later on, North GALIANO Fire Department joining them very shortly after BC Wildfire in a helicopter, and then neighboring island fire departments. Parks Canada helped out, and then we brought in as well contract structure protection crews to start placing some sprinklers and other sorts of structure protection on nearby homes. In a total, about 100 people responded to that wildfire. There was an evacuation order. That was for a part of I think 2 roads for the most part, consisted of about 120 residents. Most of those residents ended up being housed by friends, neighbors, or an online island building system that happened there. All of those folks were able to return to their home within about 3 days. And the other thing that's often little known is that once that fire moved into that heavier standing timber, in general, it did not have much success in being able to spread in those fuels. So we saw fairly minimal spread, in general, less than 2 tree lengths of spread into mature fuels from that logging block. And the closest that fire ever got to a home was about 150 meters. So much closer than I would be comfortable with. However, it's not exactly like those flames were licking at the edge of homes. And the reason we're talking about this fire is because I think it's a really good example about the types of fires that we should be preparing for. on the Gulf Islands, the types of fires that we're going to see more of. So what that fire was a moderate intensity fire behavior. And so if you look at the bottom, as fire practitioners, we often talk about fire rank. And so that we're talking about rank 2, 3, and 4 wildfires that we should be preparing for. Those fires, because we have relatively small islands, may end up evacuating individual blocks, perhaps individual parts of neighborhoods. And generally those fires are going to be lasting several hours to several days. What is a lot less likely? So something that I don't think it's something we plan for as emergency managers, but it's not something I think that you should consider likely at any time in the near future, is a high intensity crown-driven fire behavior. So that's that rank 5, that rank 6, the types of things that we're seeing in the interior right now, for example. We're not really looking at, it's very unlikely that we would be considered an evacuating an entire island or an entire community. And it's very unlikely that we're going to see a fire that lasts several weeks or several months. So that's the type of things that are just a lot less likely. Now, just to pivot from fire to things that are a little bit more common these days is wildfire smoke. I'm going to play you a short animation here. This comes from NASA. It came from 2017. And what I'm hoping to demonstrate here is that if you remember 2017, there was a lot of smoke in our area in the Southern Gulf Islands and in all of BC. And that smoke came from a lot of different sources. So just because you have some smoke in your area, it's very unlikely that it's coming from Duncan or coming from anywhere on the island or even the coast. Much more likely to be either interior BC or California, Alaska. That smoke is traveling from a very long way away. And why do we even care about smoke at all? It's because we're learning more and more every year about the damage, the health damage that can be caused by fine particulates. We call it PM 2.5s. We're seeing increase in all sorts of diseases that you would not expect during smoke times, during wildfire smoke in your area. And that could be increase in things like heart attacks, in strokes, in obviously asthma and respiratory conditions. And the folks who are at the greatest risk there, small children, pregnant women, the elderly, anyone with heart or lung conditions, anyone who has to work or play sports outside. And so if you do have wild smoke in your area, and I can almost guarantee we're going to have some wildfire smoke in our area this time. There's a lot of smoke sitting in that interior. All it's going to take is some sort of outflow condition. That smoke is going to be moving our direction. Don't evacuate. Often that's our first instinct is let's get out of here. But generally speaking, you're going to end up exposing yourself to more smoke by trying to travel during that time. And that smoke is moving on a really large scale, just like you saw in that previous slide. It's moving in, it's moving out. You're not going to be able to escape it probably, and you're probably going to expose yourself to more smoke than if you had stayed inside, limited your outdoor activity, closed your windows and blinds. The only thing I'm going to add at the end there is that the other threat during summer is heat. And so if you find that you think that heat is going to be a bit of a bigger risk to you than that smoke, in that case, it probably is better to open your windows, open your blinds, breathe in that smoke, and make sure that you can stay cool. So that kind of ties up what to expect when you have a fire. Oftentimes, when we think about fire, we have a sense of helplessness. You know, you see these pictures, for example, of Lytton and other places in the interior. That fire is building and it's sweeping over that town, eating up everything in its path. And that's what we can expect here. And it's just not the case. Actually, what you can do to prepare now makes a real difference for your family and your home. You are not helpless, far from it. The first thing you need to do is have a plan. Make as many decisions as you can for what you would do if you need to leave your house in a relatively quick manner before you have to do that. If you are making all those decisions at the last minute, you're going to forget things. It's not going to go as well as if you had a plan, and it's worth making that plan on paper, or you can do it on phone or some other digital media. Just make it, don't just do it in your head, sit down and think about it for 5 minutes. No, commit that to paper. Where are you going? Where are your loved ones? What do you need to support yourself in your particular situation? And then it's best to make some sort of kit to support your plan. So when I'm talking about a kit, the types of things that you want to have available, ready to go so that you can leave in a relative hurry include a first aid kit. They include food. We recommend up to at least a week's worth of food and water. It can include special types of clothing. It may include any kinds of special medications, or if you have other sorts of health conditions, anything that you would need to support those health conditions. And it's really up to you guys individually to have a plan, have a kit, be prepared. It's not something that we as in the Emergency Operations Center or the Incident Command can do for you. We are really relying on your own personal preparedness to keep you safe during an emergency. And once you have some of that gear, we definitely recommend that you have a grab and go kit. That's good for all sorts of things. It doesn't have to just be a wildfire. It can be all sorts of personal emergencies when you just have to pick up and go for any sorts of reasons. And the last thing I'm going to push on in that the kind of the big three here, having a plan, having a kit, and just knowing what's going on, knowing what your hazards are, is having that emergency disaster information. And I'm plugging the public alert notification system. It's a system that we've developed here in the Capital Regional District. Really excited about it. It's really incredible. What it does is it takes emergency situations, it takes emergency information, life safety information about a disaster in your area specific to you and where you are, and it instantly gives you that information. And it sends that information via a text message, a phone call, or by email. And it's not the same system as what we call Alert Ready. About twice a year, you're going to hear your phone say, and that's a different system. That's a system that the province maintains. It's not going to give you information about a wildfire or other sorts of local emergencies in your area. If you don't know if you're signed up for PANS, our public alert notification system, that means you're not. So what we're going to really implore you to do today is to visit this website. We're going to put that in the chat. We're going to send this link to you after the webinar is done. It's going to take you 3 minutes. Please sign up for this. It could save your life. The other thing I'm going to plug is Alertable. On the back end, we have this really neat tool called Alertable that has a website. You can visit it right now if you want. You're going to see emergency information for the Southern Gulf Islands and other parts of Canada. And even better, I really do recommend, if you have a smartphone with an app, you probably do, download that app. It's going to give you emergency information that is specific to where you are, not just in the Capital Regional District, but all across Canada. And perhaps the most, I think, important piece of information about what you can do to prepare is to prepare your home. And you can think, that fire is going to sweep over your area, but what can I do? Whatever I do, it doesn't make a difference. And that's just not what we find when we go to the Slave Lakes, the Fort McMurrays, even the Lyttons. We see that what people did to prepare their home really did make a difference to how likely that home was to survive. If you don't do anything at all, you can have as poor a chance as 4% of your home surviving a wildfire. So just to kind of reiterate here, what you saw, you see severe weather conditions, you see a fire start, that's this middle box. That fire spreads multiple simultaneous ignitions to the homes. Then you saw the fire department's going by, the cops are moving by, but it's too late. They're overwhelmed, and you see many homes destroyed. And so the really key part here that I wanted to kind of hammer home is that you can break that cycle, and only you can do it. We can't go and protect your home in that sense, not in the same sense that you can. You can really help us break that link between a wildland fire and an urban fire. Those ignitions that are happening in the brush, on the roofs, in the decks. And how can you do it, you may ask? Perhaps you would like to see an incredibly cheesy video with that information. Well, you're in luck. This is a really good and relatively short introduction to FireSmart. And it can show you just a few examples of what FireSmart means and how you can use it in your area.
As we continue continue to extend our lifestyles and communities into the forested and grassland areas of the country, we become more exposed to the danger of wildfire. Living where wildfires can occur puts our homes at risk, but it is possible to live safely and resiliently with wildfire. Fire Smart principles are designed to mitigate a home's vulnerability by taking proactive action on our properties to reduce wildfire risks. Homes ignite due to the condition of the home and everything that surrounds it out to 100 meters from the foundation. This is called the home ignition zone. Let's check in with the residents of Aspen Street and the community of Little Blue to see the proactive steps they're taking within their Fire Smart home ignition zone.
Hi, I'm Levi. I've lived in this house for over 25 years. Wildfire seasons are starting earlier, lasting longer, and are more intense. We need to take action. Residents in the community next to us were evacuated last week and suffered devastating loss. We need to take ownership of our part in the overlapping home ignition zones in our neighborhood, starting with the most critical zone, the non-combustible zone, which should be a minimum 1.5 meter non-combustible surface around your entire home. I've cleared the vegetation and combustible material around my house down to bare mineral soil, including combustible debris from under my deck.
Hi, I'm Sandy. Priority Zone 1 is between 1.5 and 10 meters from your home. To create a landscape that will not easily allow fire to reach our homes, my husband and I moved our renovation materials out to Priority Zone 2, breaking them into small organized piles. Firewood piles have been moved to Priority Zone 2 and patio furniture into the sheds. We also plan to incorporate some fire-resistant landscaping products into our yard.
Howdy, my name is Colin. I've been working in Priority Zone 2, 10 to 30 meters from your home. The trees of the vast forested landscape that our homes back onto need to be pruned to 2 meters to prevent fire from climbing the trees. Keeping fire on the ground will make it much easier for firefighters to manage.
Hi, I'm Alex. I've been busy in Priority Zone 3, which is 30 to 100 meters from my home. To create a fire break, we've hired a professional arborist to come in and thin out the thick spruce trees we have in Zone 3. I'm also going to prune the remaining spruce trees up to 2 meters and clear the dead and down woody debris. In subdivisions like Aspen Street, priority zones can overlap. It is important to talk to your neighbors and identify ways that you can work together.
We've all taken one small action on our properties, but we need to do more, and we need to do it together. I say we contact our local fire department and see what else we can do.
Agreed.
All right, so there you go. Really quick introduction to FireSmart. There's a ton of more information there. And what I really recommend is that if you do have a FireSmart committee in your area, and I'm thinking particularly of Saturn and Galiano, they have a lot of experts with folks who know a lot about what you can do in your area for FireSmart. And many of the islands, your fire departments, they know this stuff. They have local FireSmart representatives. Talk to them, you'll find out more. One thing I did want to just reemphasize is that really do focus on that non-combustible zone around your home and that priority zone 1. When you go to priority zone 2 and 3, that also matters. But what we're not talking about is just running into your yard with a chainsaw and leveling your trees. That's not good for the ecosystem. It's not good for fire. It's not good for anything. But what I do want to note is that a little bit of thinning and brushing actually can make your property more natural. There's a lot of people, you live on these beautiful islands for a reason. You don't want to live in a cut block. But what we often think is natural is not necessarily natural, because we've unnaturally excluded active fires for many decades. And by a little bit of thinning and a little bit of brushing, we can actually restore that natural disturbance process. And when a fire does come through, it's going to burn as a low intensity ground fire, not that high intensity crown fire. And why are we asking you to do this is really so that you can give us a chance. So when you are evacuated, normally we bring in what we call structure protection crews. I used to be a structure protection specialist. And what we do is we look at all the homes, and we're going to do everything we can in the time that we have after you're evacuated and before the fire arrives to save your home. We're going to try looking at sprinklers. If it's just as simple as moving a pile of firewood, we're going to do that so that we can save your home. But if there's nothing if you haven't done anything as a homeowner, it's going to be very difficult for us as firefighters to be successful. So we're going to have a look at your home and walk around. And if you have a cedar roof and your eaves are full of needles and you have a big open deck with bark mulch below it, I can't do anything. It's too late. We're going to have to move on to the next home. But if you do even a few of those things, I'm going to be able to place some protection or somebody like me, and we're going to be able to hopefully save your home. So one thing I do want to plug is that we are hiring a FireSmart ambassador to get this message out into not just your communities, but communities across the Capital Regional District. If that's something you're interested in, or if you know somebody who might be interested in that, please go online, please apply. So just finally, this is the last one. I know I've gone a little bit longer than I was anticipating. I want to make sure that you take something away from this today. It's great to talk about fire. It's great to share this information, but it doesn't mean very much if we don't do anything with it. And there's 3 things that you can do today, 3 things that you can do after this webinar. The first is sign up for CRD's public alert notification system. That link is in the chat. Do that, it'll take you 3 minutes. The second, I recommend downloading an app called FireSmart Begins at Home. Now, it doesn't matter if you have an iOS Apple device or if you have an Android device, that app is there. And what that app does is it walks you through a self-assessment of your own home. And once you've done that, it gives you the best, highest value things that you can do for your home. It doesn't mean that you have to necessarily rip out your roof right away or replace your siding or do kind of big expensive materials. But I guarantee you there's something that you can do today or very soon just to make your home a little bit safer, a little bit more defensible for a wildfire. And the last thing is to sit down with your family and talk about an emergency plan. Make sure that you're starting to think about what do you need an emergency kit if there is some sort of fire emergency and you have to leave your home. And so that's all I have for you today. That's been my presentation. Thank you for attending. My name is Jonathan Reimer. I'm the manager of electoral area fire and emergency programs for the Capital Regional District. That is my email address. Contact me at any time. And then I also have the address for the Southern Gulf Island Emergency Program website, where you can get a lot of good information about how to prepare for your fire and so on. And please do reach out to the emergency program or to myself for any sorts of questions. If you need information about how to keep yourself safe out there, that's really what we're here for. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our next speaker. And so Jay, I don't know if you're able to turn your camera on. There you are. Jay Zakalinsky is a personal friend of mine and a colleague for a long time. He is a wildfire behavior specialist. That is basically the highest form of practical wildfire behavior science that you can get certified in. We're lucky to have him. He is the fire management officer for Parks Canada, or at least the local park, Gulf Islands. And I'll let you share your presentation.
Sure. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, you really covered a lot of content there. All aspects from smoke to wildfire risk. For those of you that don't know me, as Jonathan mentioned, my name is Jay Zakalinsky. I'm just going to take 1 second to share this screen with you. Yeah, so a bit about my background. I've, as Jonathan mentioned, I'm a fire behavior specialist. I've spent about 20 years, mostly in Western Canada. My most recent deployment was the last deployment would have been to Australia for the bushfires. It seems like a long time ago. That was in March 2020, and right before the pandemic hit. But I did learn a lot about wildfire, both with my experience there and also throughout Western Canada. I currently work for Parks Canada, and as you know, we're based in the Southern Gulf Islands, or we have the Southern Gulf Islands National Park Reserve. So I'll just talk a bit about our fire program and also how I understand some of the risks and the preparedness that we do in the region. Jonathan, if you just want to just let me know if you can see the slideshow okay and if you can hear me okay. And I'll continue. Okay, awesome. So yeah, the Gulf Islands National Park Reserve, as you can see, it's sort of fragmented throughout the Southern Gulf Islands. Doesn't have any land on Galiano or Salt Spring. That being said, we work in this core region and we're there to help when it comes to wildfire. As Jonathan mentioned, very extensive human use history. We know this through oral history. We know it through the charcoal monitoring that we've done at places such as Roe Lake. We have a fairly good understanding of the this ecosystem sort of through the ages. So with our program, one of the protection of the people and infrastructure on our adjacent lands is our first priority. Yes, we have a mandate around ecological integrity, but we do take those any threats to the neighboring lands and safety as a top priority. So how do we do that? There's a number of ways. We start with planning. So we operate off a 10-year fire management plan, and that's sort of a guiding document for how we manage fire, what the risks are within the region. The prevention. So we work with. I work closely with FireSmart BC. We have things such as seasonal campfire bans, and we also have year-round fire bans within the region. The third aspect is wildfire risk reduction. And so that is typically manually removing fuels, such as thinning of forests. Fire preparedness. So we do maintain a preparedness level with type 2 trained crews. We have about 12 staff in the Southern Gulf Islands. And we have equipment strategically located on 3 different locations, Sydney, at Saturna and Pender, and those equipment is available to local fire departments or the BC Fire Service, our staff, whoever is sort of the first to require that. We do have a full suppression policy in the Gulf Islands. Obviously, as you guys know, any fire in the Gulf Islands will be taken absolutely is significant in the fact that you don't have a large area. So we don't have a lot of time before you want to start thinking about evacuation and understanding what that fire is going to do. And lastly, prescribed burning. It's commonly done all the way across Parks Canada, across the country since probably the 1980s. So that's entirely a science-based program, and we have done a few prescribed burns in the park reserve, and there's also a few happening in the region. So let's quickly talk about fire behavior a little bit. We have to understand what you need to actually have a fire. You need 3 things. You need oxygen, heat, and then fuel. So oxygen obviously is readily available in the atmosphere. Fuel can be anything in the forest, the grasslands, buildings, and the heat you need some sort of ignition to start a fire. So that's either going to be one of 2 ways that Jonathan mentioned. It's going to be human or lightning. We really don't have much lightning here comparative to or relative to most of the country. All studies that we've done around risk assessment is it's basically human starts that are the big concern in the Southern Gulf Islands. So the next question is, what might that fire look like? So there's a number of things that influence fire behavior. And we've got fuel, weather, and topography. So fuel is that forest. We have different, you can look at it specifically at a site level or also at a landscape level. I'll talk a little bit about weather. Obviously, that's a key one. There's a couple of features in the Gulf Islands that I'll talk about is sort of this seasonal drought that we get from this rain shadow, but we also have a marine influence, being surrounded by an ocean and be in islands, that does have an impact on overall fire danger. And then topography. In this location, the rain shadow, so I'll talk a bit about that. And I know some people have, the questions coming up about Lytton and stuff, and so some places do have their canyons. There's box canyons, stuff that really will increase fire danger. We generally don't have any of that on the Gulf Islands. It's fairly flat, or some slopes, but relatively we don't have any of those features that will lead to extreme fire behavior. So what are the fuels around here? I'm sure all of you will recognize that this is our typical sort of Southern Gulf Islands. We've got light grass fuels. On about every 2 weeks to a month, we'll look at grass curing, just so we understand like exactly how dry it is, and that factors into our calculations. Obviously, to the layperson, you can walk through the forest and clearly understand when it's dry. If you look at the picture on the top right, coastal Douglas fir, you've got some arbutus. There's a lot of space here. There's actually not a lot of fuels that we see on the ground, and all that plays into having a very light sort of moving fire that doesn't get vertical into the, get up the trees and into the crowns. Lower right, we've got a picture of a structure, a historic structure on Pender. If we actually looked at this from a fire smart perspective, that you've got fuels right up against a wood building, this wouldn't pass anything. And then on the lower right, got a bit wetter site, maybe a Salal understory, maybe Oregon grape. You might have Douglas fir, some grand fir in there, and that will produce a very different fire behavior as well. Also one that's not very conducive to that crown fire, or rank 6. So one of the key features I want to touch on here is this, the rain shadow. So this is a huge factor in the Southern Gulf Islands. We have 2 features. We got the Olympic Peninsula and then the Vancouver Island mountains as well. And you've got this moisture coming off of the ocean. Or weather systems come from the west, and bringing that moisture, they'll condense and drop a lot of moisture on one side of the range and on the top, and on the other side where we are in the lowlands, you have this drying descending air, and you often miss any precipits that's related to that. So just how big a difference is that? If you look at this map, this is annual precip. This is the Olympic Peninsula. You can see anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 millimeters a year. Southern Vancouver Island and San Juan Islands has actually, this is the biggest influences from the Olympic Peninsula. They only have about 500 to 600 millimeters a year. So that's why places like Sequim are very dry. If you look over to the Southern Gulf Islands and the Saanich Peninsula, that's a bit more impacted by also the Vancouver range, or Vancouver Island. And we're in that 700 to 800 millimeters. So it's you don't have to travel very far inland, and you get a very different amount of rain. So that's one of the major drivers of our fire risk and the fire danger that we see in this region. And so that impacts our weather. And as I watch this weather continually, daily forecast, we tune in. Anytime there's a major, low pressure or lots of moisture coming through, you always see this sort of donut shape where within the San Juan Islands and the Southern Gulf Islands, it just misses all that moisture. And so what happens is we have a continual drying out of this area, where other places are getting rainfall. And so it really varies up to, 2 to 5 kilometers away, very different rain amounts. So it's very important we try to track that data as closely as we can to understand the fire risk. But the other big thing I want to talk about is the marine influence. Having fought fire in different countries and also different parts of the country, with the marine environment, we have this constant high level or higher RH than you would find on the continent. And with that, fire behavior is closely tied to relative humidity. And so that will also reduce the likelihood of starts. And so being islands in nature, you know, no matter where you go, one or 2 kilometers in each direction, we've got this influence from the water, which, you know, is a very different temperature than inland heating, which is what you would see in the interior BC or the interior of the US. So what is a fire risk, and how do we determine that? And you know, are we prepared? Are we doing enough? What are we doing? These are all questions I know that you guys have. It's questions that I work to understand. In 2010, there was a third-party study that was done looking at the Southern Gulf Islands, and took mainly using a panel of experts and then also data to determine like where's the most likely, where are we going to get those starts, what are the consequences. As when you look at risk, you have to think about 2 things. It's the likelihood is the probability times the consequences. If you've got, as you see this is Saturna Island, if you have a small 1 hectare fire in the middle and it doesn't impact the rest of the island, what was the consequence of that? If you have it near homes or where there's a single egress, it's going to be a much larger consequence. And so what we've done is looked at the takeaways from this project, which in 10 years, things have changed. There's been a fire hall built at this end of the island where egress was identified as an issue. There's also a recent logging block. So both of these things change that assessment. So it's important that we're constantly updating this information. It's not reflected in these particular graphs. A few of the key takeaways from this, as Jonathan mentioned, is outflows. There's the key. Outside of outflows, the fire risk drops dramatically, and human ignition is sort of the key driver as far as risk, and whether that's from industry, recreational fires, and then the odd lightning strike, which I would say we get maybe in the 14 years I've been here, we'd get maybe 1 lightning strike fire every 3 to 4 years. I won't go too much more into the outflows, but you do understand this is when we really start to pay attention as fire professionals. And this is very similar to the conditions that we saw in the last week, where we've got these very dry conditions that are very uncharacteristic of the region that we live in. And so with that comes a significant increase in fire behavior. And why is because we have that dry air, that lower RH. And that's, as we all know, what we saw in the last week with the temperatures and the low RHs, that's obviously something I don't think any of us have seen in our lifetime. So climate is changing, things are happening, and we need to be able to adapt and understand these, how these things will impact us. So I'm going to jump up to fuel management. So this is one of the things that we can do to break that weather, that triangle. I'm just going to jump back here for 1 second. So with both of these triangles, basically to remove fire, we just have to collapse. Somehow we have to either remove the oxygen, smothering it, remove ignition, or we can modify fuel or remove some fuel. So that's how we eliminate fire. How do we alter the fire behavior? There's very little, we can't really change the topography, such as the rain shadow, where we live, that it's an island, and the weather, we have very little influence over it. I used to say we never had any influence over it, but with climate change, obviously now we're starting to see there are changes, but we can't create a weather cloud. So what we can work on is altering that fuel. So that is part of, within Parks Canada, we look at fuel management. It's done at many different scales. If you think around Banff and Jasper, there's incredible amounts of time and money that are put into protecting these town sites that are, you know, in a valley that hasn't had fires for years. We're not in that scenario here, but I do think it's important that we start to look at some of these options. And in this last year or 2 years, we have started several projects the key one being on Pender Island. So using those risk assessments, I realized that this was next to Magic Lake Estates. For those that are familiar with it, we've got the park reserve right above with Roe Lake. There is a risk here. This is where we're in that urban interface, as we are with most places in the Southern Gulf Islands, which is sort of a 2 kilometers. You've got forest and homes. So I wanted to make sure that we're able to have a defensible space. And what I mean is that we can safely send in crews, or we can stop a fire, or have a fire naturally remain a surface fire and low intensity fire, rather than getting up in the crowns under certain conditions. If you can imagine a fire from a home here, it could get into the park or the community, or if you have a fire in the park, it could also move into the community. So we treated 7.5 hectares here as an initial experiment, but also to, like I said, so that we've got a space that we can access crews, or put crews in there safely, and also access that water at Roe Lake. So what did it look like? The picture on the left, this was all logged. You can see the old growth stumps there. It's all pretty even aged. These are small, less than 20 diameters of breast height trees. They will and are naturally dying. However, what we essentially do is accelerate that process by removing them from that natural thinning, by thinning up to 2 meters and removing a certain spacing. And this borders neighboring properties now, and so we've got a good buffer with the neighboring community. And so it was important that we tracked things such as the amount of fuel that we removed, the man hours that took, and the cost, so that we can essentially apply this potentially to other parts of the Gulf Islands. And I also feel that it's sort of one of the aspects of it. I think it starts a conversation of whether this is, what are the right tools to be using in the Southern Gulf Islands. Doing nothing or suppressing fires, which has been done for the past 100 years, we know isn't working. And there's a lot of proven methods that are being used not only here, but also around the world. So last one, I want to talk a little bit about FireSmart again. This is coming back to what we can do, or what you can do. And as Jonathan mentioned, I think just start at home, start right around your property in the non-combustible zone. Maybe just pick up some of those loose sticks, remove the firewood from against your house, move a few things into zone 1 or 2. I agree with Jonathan that not to, we live in a beautiful place. The fire risk is moderate threat. Even though we'll see like extreme values, the type of wildfire we'll see here is not equivalent to interior, for many of the reasons that we've laid out. That being said, I think things are changing. I take the stance that if we slowly start making small gains and preparing ourselves, we don't know what climate will be like 15, 20 years from now, but it starts today. And so that you're prepared if in the event we do have a larger fire in the future. So with that, that's the conclusion, my aspect of the presentation. Jonathan and I will be here to answer questions. I know there's a number coming in. I'll stop sharing my screen here, Jonathan, if does that work?
Sure. No, thank you very much, Jay. That's excellent. I think we should all be thankful that we have the amount of prepared agencies in our area to respond. I know we can feel like not just literal but figurative islands out there, and we're actually fairly well resourced to be able to respond in a very timely manner with a number of resources, and that includes Parks Canada. So thank you and I really like the way that Parks Canada thinks about fire in terms of the ecological integrity of the ecosystem, and I think that's something we all move to these areas for, to be honest. So we're going to go to questions. So if you guys haven't already, please open up that Q&A. We do have a number of questions in there already. And one theme we saw that I'm just going to start off with is that dichotomy between the interior and the islands. Why should we think that it's anything different than the islands? How would we respond if we had the type of fire that we have in the interior? That's the type of questions that we're seeing in some of the chat. And I'll try and do my best to answer this one. I'll tackle this, and if you want to jump in, Jay, feel free. So I started my career in the Fraser Canyon, actually. So I started firefighting in a place called Boston Bar. It's about 20 minutes to the south of Lytton. And so I've seen a lot of fire behavior in that area. And it is a very unique place to fight fire. You're probably aware that Lytton is the hot spot in Canada. Generally, it almost always has the hottest temperatures in summer on any given day. And it's a place that sees really intense fire spread. I myself, as a fire incident commander, watched the fire start right at the bottom. It's a very steep canyon. Fraser, people used to drive through it all the time before the Coquihalla started, but now no one ever goes down there. But it's a very steep canyon. Fires do sometimes start down from camping or lightning, even down low in that valley near the river. And I watched one fire go from the river all the way to the top of the mountain, more than 1,200 meters up, in less than 15 minutes. So just intense fire behavior there. And that's for a number of reasons. Jay mentioned the canyon effects. There's a lot going on there in terms of both fuels and winds and just fire behavior or sort of fire weather. And it's fairly different in almost every way than the types of fire we can see here. And I know that can be a little bit confusing because our fire danger today and for the last several weeks has been extreme, and their fire danger is extreme. So it should be similar. But the fire danger rating is a little bit of an interesting tool. We use it not as much to communicate your objective risk levels. We don't use it to compare areas that have danger to areas that don't have danger. We're telling you the relative risk. And so when you're an extreme in an area, you can imagine we get to in extreme levels, not all the time, but certainly fairly common in places like Tofino, which are a rainforest. But you can imagine it's not going to support the same type of fire in extreme that Lytton would. And the reason that we're not the same as the interior, and I'm just going to kind of reiterate what I said earlier, really has to do with we don't get nearly as many ignitions, mostly because of that lightning difference, but also because we see less human-caused ignitions. The temperature just isn't similar at all. Very moderate temperatures here, really high RHs. I can't stress that enough. That relative humidity makes such a difference. And our fuels are really just nothing like the light, flashy fuels that get instantly up into the canopy, like they do in some parts of the interior. Also, the slope there. Slope does increase fire behavior. And so, we do have some slopes on Galiano, on Saturna, on Pender, on other areas, but not for the types of large, long slopes that you get there where you can sustain that increased fire behavior for a long time. And then we don't get the types of canyon winds, that canyon effect. So very different, very unlikely, basically not likely at all. You never say never in emergency management because you live long enough to be wrong, but very unlikely that we would see a fire start near town, near a place that has a lot of people living there, and then spread many hundreds of meters within the first minutes, like we saw there at Lytton, which means that you will not be running for your lives with 5, 10, 15 minutes. That's just not the type of behavior that we're seeing in this area. Is there anything on that subject that I missed there, Jay, that you'd like to add?
Yeah, there's a couple things that came to mind. Is that one thing that we haven't had in the Gulf Islands is fires on the landscape. So a lot of places have, as you know now in BC, there's about 200 fires, on the landscape, and those are out there subject to the weather every day. And for example, what I saw in Australia, similar to BC, you've got millions of hectares of land that burns. Most of that happened in Australia in about 6 days. And so you've got a scenario where you have a lot of fire on the landscape, and then you get these extreme wind events. And Lytton was an extreme wind event with the 70K winds. The alignment of a new fire start with that is very very unfortunate the way that lined up. However, if we had a 2-hectare fire burning on one of the Southern Gulf Islands, that is being actioned, it's been there for a couple of days, and then we've got a major southeast wind coming in, that's when we got to get worried. We're like, okay, we've got a fire, we've got this weather coming in, we need to evacuate people, we need to get more resources on this. We just don't see that sort of interaction in the Gulf Islands. So I think the concern in the Gulf Islands with Gulf Islanders is that it'll just take that one fire, a Lytton type thing, and we're going to lose what we have. I think that's a really highly unlikely scenario. 2 is just, you would need to have the start happen in a place on a day that you've got these extreme conditions, extreme wind, which was the case in Lytton.
Excellent. We have a few more questions in the chat. One here kind of plays off that same idea, and it is, how are we basically going to get a ferry to evacuate an island in time during a fast-moving fire? And I just want to reiterate a little bit about how unlikely it is that we're going to be evacuating people off island in general for a fast-moving wildfire. Again, we never say never, and we do have plans to that effect as emergency managers. But very likely you're going to see something like we talked about in 2006, where you have a few blocks impacted. Those people can generally be accommodated on island. If it is a longer event and we don't have enough places for people to sleep, we'll be able to transport those people in a fairly orderly manner through BC ferries. It's not going to be people swimming through the ocean onto the ferry. That's not the type of event that we're really likely to see at all. And so I wouldn't spend much time kind of panicking or being fearful about that situation. We have enough risk in our area from seismic, from winter storms, from wildfires and extreme heat, that we don't need to look for other scenarios for us to worry about. So the next question: should you remove, cut, or dead branches from your forest ground and property, or mulch them and spread them back under the trees? What is with naturally fallen trees that are habitat for wildlife and slowly degrade? Should they be removed from the property? And so there's a little bit of subtlety to this answer. Basically, mulching, it has actually been an open question, but there was just a study done several months ago where it did seem like chipping and restoring those chips to your property did increase your fire risk. So generally, we do recommend ways to find that deadfall, that winter deadfall, clean out that area around your house in that priority 1, 2, 3 zones, and find a way to remove those and either burn them when it's safe to do so, or if you have a chipping program, mulching program, something where you can take it off and away from the property so it's no longer a hazard. That's what we recommend. And as far as habitat for wildlife, and that is the case for some of those trees, I would say look at the tree. If it's relatively intact, it's actually not generally going to be, I think, from my perspective, Jimmy might know more about as an ecosystem manager. If you have an intact tree, what you really are talking about maybe some of that red rot, when that tree degrades a little bit, can you have that on your ground? And honestly, that's probably not going to spread the fire very quickly. So I'm not as concerned about red rot as I am about dead and dying trees that have come down recently, and you have those needles on it or some amount of fine fuels on it. So smaller branches, that stuff will carry fire and it will spread fire fairly quickly. Any thoughts on that, Jay?
Yeah, my main response there would be to think about the connectivity. So if you've got a dead tree over your house is one thing. If you've got these are connected directly to some outbuilding or something. If it's just dead and lying on the ground, it's depending on the size of it, it's just it is fuel for a fire, but if it's not connected to anything else, it will just burn at that site. So it's not, that's why we're emphasizing focusing right on the house itself, so that if there were any embers from anything within that 10, 30 meters away, or even 5 to 15, that it's not going to be intense enough that it creates a bunch of embers that would transfer to your house. So it's trying to strike a balance there. Obviously, it's a bit trickier on a landscape level. I think on the yard level, you can make that call yourself if you want to have a more natural yard, or just keep it really tidy, close to your house is what I would recommend. Once we go further out, like where we were treating, like we have to balance the risk of that, removing dead fuel from the ecosystem with the ecosystem itself, and the risk of a fire, which would potentially have more catastrophic impacts than a disturbance, mimicking a disturbance.
Unmuted
I think
there.
you're on.
So yeah, it's a phrase of the pandemic, isn't it? You're on mute. Another related question: minimum clearance distance that I should allow around my house. And there's a couple ways to interpret that. What I'm really going to do is encourage you to go to firesmartbc.ca. That's going to give you all of the different information, because there's a couple ways to interpret that question. But I think the one that is really clear, that we should all be clear on, is that we want 1.5 meters around your house, around the outside of your house. Draw a line, get your ruler out, tape measure more likely, and have a non-combustible zone. So what we really mean is nothing that can burn. So no hedges. We're talking about no wooden decks even. So you want to find something else. If you do have a wooden deck, there are ways to reduce the risk of that. Go onto the fire site, you'll see more, but definitely no accumulated bark mulch, for example, or needles, or firewood, that sort of thing. You can't have that within 1.5 meters, and some of that stuff should be more than 10 meters really away. The next question: what would be a realistic response time for BC Wildfire and BC Parks to get to the scene? And so maybe I'll let Jay speak to Parks Canada. I'll speak to BC Wildfire. What we observed in 2006 for the GALIANO fire was 17 minutes from the time they were dispatched to the time they arrived by helicopter. That's a very good response time. I don't know if we'd get that every time. When there is a high fire danger like that, they often put crews on red alerts. Those crews are literally, they packed the helicopter, they're sitting inside the helicopter. It is hot as heck. I have done this work myself, and they are waiting for a fire. They can't leave all day. That's what they wait for. And there usually is a fire somewhere that they're able to go to and respond. So very quick responses. From Parks Canada, do you have any message?
Yeah, like I've been on those crews as well, even rappel crews, where you're just on standby all day waiting for a fire. In the Gulf Islands, we have staff scattered throughout the islands doing different jobs throughout the day, and it depends on where someone is and where vessels are. Will depend on that response time. So anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour depends on where the vessel and the gear is. So there's a bit of a coordination there, and we also work with the local fire departments and BC Wildfire to help transfer crew by vessel if required. So,
and I'm going to do 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap up. I know it's been quite a bit of a session, but we do hope you learned something here. So the second last question: is there a risk from using a gas outdoor fire pit on a property? And I'll answer this both yes and no. Yes, there's always a risk. Anytime you're using fire, there's a risk to using that fire. Anytime you light even a contained barbecue, it's something you need to think about. Certainly, anytime you light a cigarette, it's something you need to think about. However, a gas outdoor fire pit, they don't throw sparks in the same way that a campfire does. And in general, those what we call fire appliances are permitted use. We don't ban them. We don't ban them generally during campfire bans. We don't ban them at all. We generally allow those year round. And the reason we do that is because if it is built as designed, they're usually designed quite well. You're basically having, it's basically a barbecue. You know, you have propane, it's shooting out little flames, it's self-contained, unless you have put that fire up against some sort of fuel source. So if it's on really dry grass, perhaps, if it's right up against a tree, if you somehow tipped it over, if kids maybe were playing with it, that would be a fire risk. However, the fire risk is much lower than other sorts of appliances. Last question. It's a bit of a longer one. What can you do if neighboring properties do not maintain their forests and dead western red cedars are piling up on their forest floor? Is there an agency that checks private properties and makes recommendations? That is a good question. And it's a question we often get. They address it really quickly there in the video, is that you have these priority zones overlap. You can protect your own home, but what kind of risk your home is at does depend often on what your neighbor does. And right now, there is not a simple way to make anyone do anything. So we recommend through fire smart committees, through neighborhood committees, you can use soft power, you can use education, you can even kind of suggest different tools, or maybe even suggest doing some of that work yourself. But there's no way legally that you can force your neighbor to clean up their area. It is possible that might be something we look at in the next 5 to 10 years. There are certain areas of the Okanagan, and it's something we're actually talking about fairly actively on Salt Spring Island right now, where you would be required to get a fire smart permit to build in a certain area and to maintain that permit. I think that is several years away. But if that's something you're in favor of, it's a conversation that the CRD would like to have with Islands Trust, and it's something the Islands Trust has said that they're perhaps open to. It is a land planning thing, and so there's a myriad of government organizations that administer your islands, but that piece of it would be the Islands Trust, and we as a CRD, certainly, if I'm representing them, are interested in engaging them on how can we ensure that folks are taking care of themselves and taking care of the landscape, because what they do on their properties doesn't just affect their property. Do you have any tips on what homeowners could do to encourage their neighbors to be responsible with Fire Smart, Jay?
No, I think you covered it there. Some of that was new information to me with sort of what's coming down the pipe, but I think, there's nothing that no mechanism other than be a good neighbor and, work with these local committees and, just advocate maybe for this is, within your community. And yeah.
Exactly. And with that, we'll end the question period. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I know this was kind of an hour and 45 minutes of your time. I hope it was well spent. I wish all of you a really safe fire season, and I hope you all learned something. So with that, thank you very much for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day.